Hello, my name is Neil Ide from Skyway Software, and in this screencast I'm going to give you an overview and demonstration of the Spring MVC code generation capabilities of MyEclipse for Spring. Here's the general outline for the screencast. First we will create the web project, then we'll generate the Spring MVC software components, then we'll deploy to Tomcat, we'll review the running application, and finally I'll review the generated code. Before I get started, let me briefly introduce MyEclipse for Spring. MyEclipse for Spring is a joint product from Genuitech and Skyway Software, and as you probably figured out by the name, MyEclipse for Spring is a special version of MyEclipse that is targeted at Spring development. It is comprised of all the great features that come with Eclipse, plus an additional set of Spring-specific extensions, including a developer sandbox that includes the Derby database and Apache Tomcat and provides an instant environment for Spring development, Spring tools for maintaining Spring artifacts including project validation, bean graphs, content assist, and refactoring support, wizard-driven tools for quickly setting up Spring projects with all required configurations and dependencies, including support for Eclipse-based and Maven-based projects, rich annotation editors for Spring, JAX-WS, and JPA that work in tandem with the standard Eclipse code editors, and code generation that helps developers rapidly generate a very broad set of software components and is very easy to use and is the focus of this screencast. Here's a high-level inventory of the different types of application components that can be generated using MyEclipse for Spring. As you can see, there are several application groups, and for each group there are many application components that can be generated. The focus of this screencast is Spring MVC code generation, and the primary goal is to generate Spring MVC application components. So at a minimum, I must direct MyEclipse for Spring to generate the Spring MVC application group. However, I will also direct MyEclipse for Spring to generate the service, data access, and domain application group, and here's why. One of the benefits of generating the other application groups is that you will end up with everything you need to immediately start validating and testing the generated Spring MVC components. You don't have to wait until the software components are integrated with the rest of your application to see them in operation. You will have a fully implemented application that can be immediately deployed and tested. Another benefit of generating the other application groups is that it serves as a reference implementation for how the generated Spring MVC components integrate or interact with the other components of an application. This helps new developers learn Spring MVC and associated best practices, and it also helps experienced developers quickly understand the dependencies of the generated software components. So the first thing we're going to do is actually create a web project, and this is really simple to do. This is the MyEclipse environment. You right click on the package explorer, specify new web project, and all you really need to do is give your project a name. All the other options for now will keep the defaults, and then you click finish, and you now have your project set up and ready to go. In the introduction, I mentioned that MyEclipse for Spring comes with a sandbox, and that includes Derby and Apache Tomcat. And what we're going to do for this screencast is we're actually going to generate the Spring MVC software components from 4 tables that are included or that ship with the sample Derby database that's included in MyEclipse for Spring. We have the customer, payment, office, and employee table, and you can see from here what the cardinality is between these different objects. And I've also checked off the ones that are going to be the top level entities in our user interface. So in order to access the code generation functionality, we're going to go ahead and right click on the project, and from the MyEclipse menu we will select Scaffold Spring CRUD Application. And this will bring up a wizard which will walk us through the rest of the process. And as I pointed out just a few moments ago, we're going to be scaffolding from a database table, so we will check database schema as our inputs. We will go ahead and select from the database connections. In this case, we only have one connection. This connection is automatically set up when you install MyEclipse for Spring. And then I'll go ahead and select the database itself, which is Classic Cars, and I will select the 4 tables that I want to scaffold from for this example. I'll add them to the scaffolding list. Then I'll specify which objects are my top level objects from a user interface perspective. So which ones do I want end users to be able to navigate in the UI. Next, I will specify which layers of the application I want generated, as well as what package names I want used in the generated code. And as you can see, I specify one package name, and it will automatically carry that package name over using several conventions into the other layers. Here's where I can select from the different web client types that are available. So since we are going to be generating Spring MVC software components, I'm going to go ahead and check off the Spring MVC option and click Next. For now, we will skip the REST and JSON support. This panel is used, and we're just going to keep it with the defaults for now. I'll keep the defaults here. This basically is allowing me to configure what folders I generate to. This next panel allows me to configure which libraries, and it's automatically pre-selected several libraries for me that I'm very likely going to need. And then finally I can click the Finish button, and that will go ahead and kick off the code generation, and within a few moments I will have a generated application with all of the software components that I've directed my Eclipse for Spring to generate for me. Okay, so the next step is, before we actually take a look at the code, let's actually deploy the application by selecting Run as My Eclipse Server Application. And what this is going to do is actually going to deploy the application to the Tomcat instance that is in the developer sandbox, and the application will deploy, will initialize, and then within a few moments you will see the application show up within the embedded browser. Or if you prefer, you can also just copy the URL and access it from a different browser if that's what you prefer. Okay, so now let's take a peek at how the application looks. I'll go ahead and expand this so that we can see more of the application. And this is the dashboard, and we're going to access the Spring MVC. So we go into View, Customers, and this will show us a list of customers from the sample database. And then I can go ahead and actually select to view a specific record, in which case I will see the details from the record as well as any related entities. And as I pointed out, customer has a relationship to payment, so what we're seeing is all of the payments. I can also go ahead and edit the records, and it will have a form there for entering in all the data. I can also choose to delete the record by clicking the delete icon as well. And if I want to actually create a new record, one of the things you'll notice is that we're making use of tooltips as well as client-side validation to make sure that the data that you're entering matches the type of data that was expected from the database that you actually generated your application from. So it's really very useful stuff. And then in the dashboard you can also view the other entity, which is the other top level entity that we scaffolded, and here I can take a look at the the employee, and from the employee I can also see exactly which office they're from. And once again, I can create a new employee record and have those saved to the database and everything. So what you have here are basically all of the components for the Spring MVC application, also utilizing those other components from those other layers that we also generated. The next step is for us to actually take a look at the software components that were generated and take a look at the code itself. Before we do that though, I want to briefly cover this layer diagram. We have a layer diagram for each of the different types of applications or the software components that are generated by my Eclipse for Spring. In this particular screencast, we're really interested in the Spring MVC software components. But you can see from this diagram we also generated all of these other components in order to have a full ready to run application. If you're interested in more details regarding the Spring MVC blueprint, or you want to study the blueprints for any of the other software components that are generated by my Eclipse for Spring, please go to the online help or to the embedded help within Eclipse. You will find a lot more detail on all of those. Okay, so let's start taking a look at the project. The first thing you'll notice is that the project has all of the libraries that are required in order for this application to run. This makes it really easy and really fast way for you to get your project started. You didn't have to go hunting around for different jar files, etc., etc. The next thing that we'll do is take a brief look at the generated code. So as you can see, we have 4 packages. These are the package names that we specified when we actually scaffolded or generated the code. And in the web folder, we have 2 controllers. The customer controller is a fully implemented Spring MVC controller that is immediately available for you to use. And as you can see, we already ran it, so you know that it's running and that it's operational. And for every controller, we also generate a JUnit test. So that's why you'll see for each controller a matching Java file that has test at the end. The other thing worth mentioning is that for every database table, we created a JPA entity for you. And there's a lot of other things were generated in the service layer as well as in the DAO layer. And we'll leave it to you to actually go in and dig and take a closer look at the generated code. But the point is that we generated the code. You've seen that the code is operational, that it runs, that it's high quality code from a runtime standpoint. And now you can actually take a look at the implementation and take whatever you need and bring them into your own projects or modify this code and use this code as you wish. The resources folder is where you'll see we have things like resource bundles, where we keep everything, all the labels and all of the UIs and everything are all done using resource bundles. So for every entity, we have a properties file that has all of the text associated with that particular entity, and it's used throughout the application. We also have separate context files for every layer of the application. The web layer, which is the primary focus of the screencast, if you open it up in an XML editor, you'll see that it's doing it has all of the Spring configuration. You didn't have to go in there and do any of this. It was all done automatically for you. And it saves you a lot of time. And then of course, this file is yours to do with as you wish. If you need a modifier or you want to further customize what was done, you can go ahead and do that. We have the Hibernate property files, the JTA property files, several other property files that are needed as part of a running application. These were automatically created for you so that you don't have to create these, but you can just modify them. So next, let's go and take a look at what was actually generated in the web root folder. Here you'll see we really dropped in some really basic CSS and some images for you to use as a starting point in the look and feel of your application. Of course, you can change it as you wish. And then we actually have within the web inf folder, we have several things that are generated in there. The primary one that we're interested in is in the pages folder, which is where all of the JSP pages are actually generated. And what you'll notice here is that we have, for every entity, we have a list of JSP pages for listing, editing, deleting, menus, viewing, etc., etc. And so what you can do is actually use these components independently. Or in this case, for this application, we also are using site mesh, which basically brings all of those individual components into a full application. And you can see in the common folder that's where we have the common header, footer, dashboard, login screens, etc., etc. And then in the decorators folder is where we actually have it's the site mesh components that actually bring everything into a full user interface. We also generate the default Spring application context file as well as the web.xml file with all of the configuration necessary to support Spring MVC. So we save you a lot of time by not having to do all this by hand. And once again, you can customize it as you need to. Anyway, that is the end of the screencast. If you want to learn more about My Eclipse for Spring, please go to the following URL or follow us on Twitter at @Genuitech or @Skyway Software, or also go to the My Eclipse for Spring YouTube channel where you can find this screencast as well as many other screencasts on a variety of other topics related to My Eclipse for Spring. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.